takes place around the table. And it wasn't only for a nice touch, so to speak, it's much more. Luke placed a profound theological significance on meals as you read through Luke and catch that richness about those teachings around meals. Bread was important. Breaking bread was important. So important, in fact, the real test of whether the church included persons who were different wasn't the point of baptizing them, but of eating with them. Fellowship meals were central in the early church's life together. Let us not forget, Jesus, the risen Lord, was known to them in the breaking of the bread. And Jesus today in our text is exposing a patronage system in Roman Palestine. This system involves two unequals, one who has much and the other who has little, or the haves and the have-nots in society. Our gospel reading this morning is about more than sitting around a table and breaking bread. It is also about things which are self-seeking both as a guest and as host. Listen now to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, verse 1 and 7 through 13, from the Common English Bible. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to share a meal in the home of one of the leaders of the Pharisees, they were watching him closely. When Jesus noticed how the guests sought out the best seats at the table, he told them a parable. When someone invites you to a wedding celebration, don't take your seat in the place of honor. Someone more highly regarded than you could have been invited by your host. The host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give your seat to this other person." And embarrassed, you will take your seat in the least important place. Instead, when you receive an invitation, go and sit in the least important place. When your host approaches you, he will say, "Friend, move up here to a better seat." Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. Then Jesus said to the person who had invited him, "When you host a lunch or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers and sisters, your relatives, and rich neighbors. If you do, they will invite you in return, and that will be your reward. Instead, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they can't repay you. Instead, you will be repaid when the just are resurrected." Thus ends the reading of our gospel. Have you ever heard or seen, when you've read scripture, Jesus refusing a good meal? Jesus loved banquets. Jesus loved to eat and to celebrate with family and friends. And I can imagine Jesus observing the gathering of people who vied to position themselves for the best seat in the house. Who knows? He might have even chuckled a time or two to himself as Jesus eyed each guest, attempting to appear more distinguished than the rest. Most folks wanted to be up front as a sign of recognition, a sign announcing you are a special guest, an important guest, or a guest of honor due to your role in life. Our gospel reading talks about how our attitudes about ourselves and others surface in the context of dining, of eating together, as seen by Jesus as Jesus watched others gathering for the banquet. Here we find Jesus telling us about what folks do when arriving at a banquet or an important party with fancy seats and a prepared meal and places of high honor, higher places to sit, and for the general invitees. Places weren't marked like they are today, like place cards matter today. It doesn't seem to stop folks from moving them around, does it? So an invited guest then might not know their ranking as a guest, to be able to sort of figure out where they were even to sit. Yet they tried to get as close to the front as possible. For many guests, something else enters the picture. The self-seeking mentioned earlier. This self-seeking also is known as ego. And Jesus tells us about what he witnesses as he comes into the banquet hall. Much like a horse race or a bicycle race, where all start out at that starting line or here at the door. And they're all jockeying for, and they all try to get the spots of honor. The front 2 or 3 positions, which will show everyone they are the winners who will take home one of the medals. They are the honored guests. Here, Jesus offers advice about how to avoid humiliation. Choose the lowliest place, and nobody else can put you down. Now, he gave quite practical counsel to folks highly concerned about appearances, and maybe a few of them might have been smart enough to grasp his wisdom. But Jesus offered more than wisdom. Though gathered for a Sabbath meal, Jesus tells them about a wedding banquet. This tells us that Jesus was talking about something much more than the evening meal following the Sabbath. Did you know Jesus referred to wedding banquets because they were one of his favorite symbols for the reign of God? They had much to tell us about ourselves and our relationships with each other. Weddings celebrate a new relationship, full of potential for the couple, the families, and for the broader community. You see, they bring forth a bond of love and new relationships which spread, transforming through the community. Jesus told the guest, those 2 who were the probable host of dinners to come. When it's your turn, he said, break free of this old mold of a guest list written in stone. Get out of the rut of having everyone seated at the same spot week after week, sharing the same worn-out conversations with only a change of location. Same old is like serving the same old leftovers week after week after week. Some direction given by Jesus advised that they choose the lowliest place, far from the head of the table, which had nothing to do with religious significance, but sound practical advice on social behavior. Jesus, speaking this as a parable, tells us Jesus is not simply talking about etiquette. Jesus is ultimately talking about kingdom behavior, which is clearly stated in verse 11 when Jesus says, "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." It's important for us, for you and I, to look at the many ways the ego can change Jesus' words into a new strategy for self-exaltation. You see, modesty can be exaggerated, and humility can be a form of pride. Thus, it would be bad if this teaching generated a mad rush for those lowest seats, while all the competitors were only looking toward the head table, waiting to be called forward. So Jesus, looking at those who host, gets their attention. And he says, by inviting all those who have the ability to invite you back, you are only generating their guest list. Your hosting can be a way of making others feel they are in your debt. Thus, they in turn will reciprocate when they prepare their guest list. And then the cycle of seeking a return on one's behavior toward others repeats and repeats itself. And common sense tells us it's to the host's self-interest not to offer self or goods to persons who cannot repay. And so it was always the same guest. But today, Jesus is holding up a mirror in front of the guest and the host so they can see themselves as Jesus sees them. How does Jesus see them? It's been said Jesus sees them as a people caught up in games of hypocrisy and social positioning, people far from the kingdom. So what will help them turn from their egos and social positioning? It's clearly difficult for people to change, especially if they refuse to answer questions when Jesus asks them, or refuse to engage in a dialogue with Jesus. So maybe having gotten their attention, Jesus tries one more time. And Jesus invites them to escape from the routine way that they host by inviting those most unlikely to have been invited in the first place. I wonder, could this invitation have started the self-impressed diners into imaginative creativity? Could they have come up with something like this? Instead of inviting each other, could each seek out a wide-ranging group of well-known and far less prestigious people? You know, one could invite a butcher and his apprentice, someone else, the milkmaid. Someone could bring the town beggar, and they might even give the gift of a bath and foot washing before reclining at table. A patriarch would send a couple of strong sons to carry that paraplegic lying near the town square. His daughter could escort the widow next door. Each guest would be invited to bring a not so regularly invited guest to round out the company. Can you imagine the unexpected table conversation that could take place? Or what could happen at such a dinner? You see, the whole tone of the gathering would change as the guest entered into the ritual of the table, where eating together would be a living expression of shared humanity. Can you imagine the enjoyment in the celebration of sharing conversation and meal together? And many different folks, with many different folks than the times prior, and with the smell and the taste and fellowship of the common need for communal relationships and meal. These guests love honor and hate shame. Thus, they live lives to gain honor and avoid shame. But what Jesus wanted the guest and the host to look at was their assumptions a look which almost certainly would have been distracting. Someone once told a story while at a large dinner banquet. He said a friend of his often comments how he is obviously favored by the host because he is invariably seated close to the lavatory. This usually brings a laugh from his table companions, while his wife points out laughing will only make him and encourage him to do more. It does, and he tells other stories, non-related. But it leads to his next comment. The last place you would want to be, he continues, is at the head table where you are in full sight of everyone. And people can watch you try to push a P on your knife with your index finger, like one up front now. Today, the Pharisees aren't playing guest and host. It's the Pharisee in all of us. Some say, as far as they are concerned, getting it out in the open is welcome. Spiritual teaching frequently suggests knowing we are in prison is the first step of getting out of prison. When we can laugh, when you and I can laugh at our inner struggles, our inner strategies of self-importance, we are unexpectedly just a little bit more than those strategies and a little bit less. We are a little bit more because we can see the bars of our self-created prison, and we can know it is locked from the inside. But we hold the key to our freedom. And we are a little bit less because if we follow the lure of our new self-knowledge, we will forego what we think makes us socially more or better than. We will be less socially, but more spiritually. But social positioning is so ingrained in us, isn't it? Most likely, you and I will find this newfound freedom painful at times, but our only hope, it's been said, is to laugh at ourselves. And so it is. When our negatives or positives grandiosity comes into view, laughter is the way you and I are restored to the simple joy of being human. But it's not the only way. Theologian Rachel Keith, a Minnesota UCC pastor, has written, the key to it all is a healthy humility, not a humility which negates or devalues anyone. Instead, a humility which recognizes all as equals before God. A humility which values all human life and tries to see Christ in all. We are called to that type of humility